There's a reason people speak over you, why they test your patience, question your worth, cross your boundaries with such casual confidence. It's not because you're weak. It's because you're predictable. You've been taught, trained, and rewarded for being agreeable, visible, soft-spoken, emotionally transparent. The world applauds you for being nice. But beneath that applause is quiet calculation, because in a world run by strategy, the visible are always the first to be used. Society never told you that being emotionally accessible is a form of self-exposure, that being easy to read means being easy to plan around, that when you explain your every move, share your every intention, and try to be liked before you're respected, you're volunteering for irrelevance. This isn't about cruelty. It's about power, about the subtle, ancient war between perception and real. Niccolo Machiavelli understood something the modern mind is uncomfortable admitting. People don't operate on truth. They operate on what they perceive to be true. And what they perceive is almost always shaped by ambiguity, not clarity. A man who reveals nothing commands more attention than one who explains everything. A woman who smiles less, speaks less, and listens more is remembered longer than the one who fills every silence, not because she's rude, but because her stillness activates curiosity, and curiosity is the first step to psychological control. You have been told that being good means being open, that kindness equals transparency, but Machiavelli warned us, in a world of wolves, the sheep who speaks first is the one devoured. In his view, power is rarely about virtue. It's about optics. It's about how you are framed in the minds of others. He wrote not to console, but to alert. A prince who is not feared, he said, will always be vulnerable, and fear doesn't require aggression. It requires uncertainty. The paradox is brutal. You've spent your life trying to be good, to be liked, to be emotionally available, but in doing so, you've removed the very thing that creates lasting respect: inaccessibility. Because respect is not built in what you offer, it's built in what you withhold. The world, with all its smiles and shallow encouragement, does not reward the obviously good. It rewards the strategically unreadable, the ones whose intentions live in shadow, the ones whose silence invites speculation, the ones who say less and are feared more. Here lies the contradiction at the heart of modern life. The more you show up with openness, the more you're passed over. The more you explain, the less they listen. The more you speak, the less you're heard. People don't underestimate you because they don't like you. They underestimate you because you're harmless. You've never taught them to hesitate before speaking to you. You've never trained them to second-guess their tone. You've never made them feel your absence, so they don't flinch. But what if they did? What if your presence didn't invite comfort, but caution? What if people didn't know what you were thinking, what you were planning, what you were capable of? What if the smile disappeared and was replaced by a calculated stillness? The most powerful people in any room are not the loudest. They are the most unreadable, the ones whose eyes say everything and mouths say nothing, the ones who seem composed when others lose control, the ones who don't need to raise their voice because their silence carries more threat than anyone else's rage. You don't need to be dangerous. You need to be perceived as someone who could be in perception. In a Machiavellian world is everything. So here's the question that will haunt the rest of this journey. What kind of person do you become when you stop trying to be good and start becoming unreadable? Not to manipulate, not to harm, but to coup. Finally command the respect you were always denied because you were too easy to define. You've been taught to be clear, to be open, to be emotionally available. You've been conditioned to think that honesty is strength, and that being fully seen is how you earn love, respect, and loyalty. But the brutal truth is this: what is fully visible is fully predictable, and what's predictable is easily controlled. This is the silent blueprint of manipulation, the premature exposure of your inner world. Not through force, through visibility. When you express your thoughts too quickly, you give others a script. When you confess your doubts, You invite strategies against you when you speak your fears. Someone somewhere begins calculating how to use them. Machiavelli knew this centuries ago. He warned, "He who shows himself too quickly teaches others how to defeat him," not because vulnerability is inherently weak, but because it arms the wrong people with too much information. In a world where power is perception, showing too much becomes self-sabotage. Look at politics. Talleyrand, the 18th century French diplomat, was once described as the man who never finished a sentence when silence would do. Through regime changes, revolutions, betrayals, and alliances, Talleyrand remained while kings and emperors rose and fell around him. His silence made him indispensable. Why? Because no one ever fully knew what he was thinking. He was unreadable, and in being unreadable, he was untouchable. In contrast, history is filled with leaders who spoke too soon. Too often Julius Caesar openly courted ambition. Napoleon wore his hunger for dominance on his sleeve. Both rose, but both fell, not because they lacked genius, but because their intentions became too easy to read. Once your next move is predictable, the opposition doesn't need to defeat you. They simply need to prepare in advance. And it's not just politics. The same pattern plays out in our relationships. The person who overshares early in a connection, the one who immediately reveals their past wounds, deepest fears, emotional triggers. They believe they're creating intimacy, but often they're creating a blueprint for manipulation, not because everyone is malicious, but because people are opportunistic. They respond to incentives, and if they learn how you work, they'll start pressing buttons intentionally or not. You say becomes data. What you show becomes instruction, and what you reveal, without boundaries, becomes leverage in someone else's game. This is the psychology of exposure. People feel more comfortable around those they can define, but comfort and respect are not the same thing. In fact, the more defined you are, the easier it is to dismiss. You consider this. In every room, there is someone whose presence commands attention without effort. They say little, but their silence speaks volumes. They don't rush to fill space. They don't overshare. They let others show themselves first. And because they don't reveal their own emotional blueprint, people become cautious around them, not fearful of harm, but respectful of the unknown. The silence isn't absence, it's strategy. It's a way of creating interpretive tension, a form of psychological control rooted not in dominance but in ambiguity. People don't obsess over what they understand. They obsess over what they almost understand, what they almost reach, the text message that never came, the sentence left unfinished, the man or woman who walks away before you're ready. That incompleteness sticks, it festers, it demands analysis, and in that analysis, the silent person gains power because they are being studied instead of studied by others. You don't need to manipulate people. You need to make them uncertain. Uncertainty creates distance. Distance breeds caution. Caution slows aggression. This is why the most dangerous people in any arena, whether social, political, or romantic, are those who keep their emotional cards close. They smile less, but they listen more. They react slower, but when they do, it's precise. They're not closed off, they're measured, and measurement is control. The modern world tells you to be authentic, but what it really means is be accessible, be vulnerable on demand, bleed in public, share everything. But here's the hidden cost. The more accessible you become, the less valuable your attention becomes. What's always available? They don't test you because they hate you. They test you because they sense you'll let them in. Every system, whether it's a workplace, a relationship, or a social hierarchy, people probe for emotional reactions. They do it subtly at first. A teasing remark, a passive-aggressive comment, a look that lingers too long, and if you flinch, if you explain, justify, defend, or overreact, they learn something vital about you. That you're accessible emotionally, psychologically, strategically. What starts as innocent teasing often becomes habitual disrespect. Because once people know where your emotional buttons are, they press them, not always maliciously, but instinctively. It's human nature. We test for weakness the same way we test for warmth, and in that test, most people fail not because they're weak, but because they're reactive. But here's the shift. What if you didn't react? What if the next time someone pushed you, you blinked instead of spoke? What if you absorbed the tension without release? What if your silence wasn't confusion, it was calculation? Emotional neutrality is not emptiness, it's precision. It's the ability to let others burn their energy while you conserve yours, and over time, it becomes psychological warfare, because when people can't predict your emotional center, they start second-guessing their own. This is what the Stoics understood. Not apathy but restraint, not detachment but discipline. Marcus Aurelius didn't train to be emotionless, he trained to be unreadable under pressure. That's the difference. You don't eliminate emotion, you withhold it as a form of power in emotional aikido. You don't meet force with force, you redirect it. If someone insults you and you lash back, they own you. But if they insult you and you nod slowly, blink once, and say nothing, they begin to wonder what you're thinking, whether they hit a nerve, whether they just started something they can't finish. Stillness becomes tension. That tension becomes presence, and presence becomes control in a negotiation. The first person to react is the one who loses leverage. It's the same in conversations, in arguments, in flirtation, in confrontation. The one who rushes to speak, to defend, to fix, to fill silence, is the one who gives up control. But the one who remains calm creates a vacuum of uncertainty, and people fear that vacuum. They try to escape it. They try to control it. They'll say more, reveal more, apologize more. And the more they do, the less you have to in relationships. This neutrality becomes a mirror instead of escalating drama. You absorb it in silence, and that silence becomes louder than any shout. You don't ignore them. You let them hear their own echo. You don't punish, you withdraw attention. And suddenly, they're chasing clarity, chasing closure, chasing you because you stopped reacting and became a presence. This doesn't mean you never feel. It means your emotions are yours, not theirs. You don't perform for others' expectations. You don't bleed on command. You don't explain your stillness. You let your stillness speak for you, and eventually, they learn. Provoking you is a waste of energy. This is how the most commanding people move through the world. With deliberate stillness, they observe more than they speak. They allow others to reveal themselves while they reveal nothing in return. And it terrifies people, not because of what might be said, but because of what might never be said there. Ask something unsettling about someone who listens calmly while others panic, who nods while others defend, who walks away mid-insult, mid-demand, mid-threat not to escape. But because they've already won the moment, this is how stillness becomes a strategy. And in a Machiavellian world, strategy is survival. You're not trying to intimidate. You're trying to make yourself untestable, untouchable, not by force, but by frame. Your neutrality tells the world, I'm not here to be moved. If you want to engage, do it with intention. Otherwise, you'll be speaking to yourself, and that changes everything now. They watch what they say, they weigh their tone, they prepare before they speak, because you've created something rare in today's world: emotional gravity. Not noise, not aggression, but quiet, deliberate stillness. And when everything else is chaos, the one who doesn't flinch becomes the one who commands. They want answers, clarity, certainty. But the moment you give it to them, you lose something in every social interaction. There's an unspoken negotiation taking place. It's not about facts, it's about perception. The one who defines the terms defines the power. And yet, most people rush to clarify themselves, to explain their behavior, to apologize before being asked. They believe this earns trust, but what it actually does is surrender frame control. Machiavelli never advised deception for its own sake. He advised ambiguity, strategic silence, because he knew this. Fear is born not from what people know about you, but from what they can't quite figure out. If someone doesn't understand your boundaries, They watch their step if they can't predict your next move. They slow theirs if they sense contradiction in your energy. They hesitate not because you're aggressive, but because you're unreadable, and unreadability is intimidating. You don't need to lie, you just need to become hard to define. Consider how most people communicate. Direct, predictable, emotionally legible. When someone criticizes them, they defend when someone questions their behavior. They explain when someone offends them. They signal injury. It's a closed loop, easily manipulated, fully mapped. But powerful people break that loop. They don't answer questions. They redirect them. They don't defend accusations. They stare blankly. They don't clarify their decisions. They say things like, "That's one way to look at it. There's more to this than you think. I understand why you'd feel that way." Phrases like these don't confirm or deny. They leave space, and in that space, people project. They speculate. They start building mental stories about who you are and what you're planning. And the more they try to define you, the more you define the dynamic. This is the art of controlled ambiguity in war. It's the decoy that draws enemy fire in negotiation. It's the pause that creates tension in relationships. It's the unanswered text that makes someone overthink, and in psychological power plays, it's the refusal to be labeled that makes others tread lightly. Ambiguity is not confusion. It's deliberate contrast. When someone expects warmth and gets cool indifference, they flinch. When they expect confrontation and get calm acknowledgement, they spiral, because contradiction creates psychological tension, and humans are desperate to resolve tension. They'll work overtime to stabilize the emotional picture you've disrupted. But when you stay ambiguous, that picture never stabilizes. It becomes a loop they can't exit, and that loop becomes your leverage. We fear what we don't understand. We avoid what we can't control. So when your behavior contradicts expectations in subtle, deliberate ways, you stop being a person they can define and become a variable they can't predict. One moment, you're generous. The next, you're silent. One day, you show warmth. The next, you're removed, not as a game, but as a signal. You cannot be reduced. This doesn't mean you should be emotionally erratic. It means you should never be fully explained. Not with your words, not with your tone, not with your decisions. You act with intention, but you allow interpretation to remain fluid, because when people don't know where they stand with you, they don't try to dominate, they try to qualify themselves. Controlled contradiction creates psychological space, enough to disrupt expectation, but not enough to break trust. It's the balance between familiarity and distance, between kindness and detachment, between showing up and vanishing. Machiavelli's genius was not that he tricked people, it's that he left room for others to trick themselves. He created frames so ambiguous that people filled them in with their own fears, desires, and assumptions. He never had to declare his power. Others assumed it, because he never explained it away. In modern life, this applies everywhere. In leadership, the boss who says little is respected more than the one who micromanages in attraction. The person who's slightly distant is pursued more than the one who's fully available in conflict. The one who doesn't over-explain keeps the upper hand, not because they're stubborn, but because they're signaling that their approval cannot be bought with understanding. So, stop thinking you owe everyone answers. Stop explaining your mood, your timing, your values, your silence. You don't need to argue to win. You don't need to clarify to be respected. Instead, start using ambiguity as your shield. If they ask you where you stand, ask them why it matters. If they push you to react, watch instead. If they label you, let them. If they project, let them sweat through their own uncertainty. You're not responsible for their comfort. You're responsible for maintaining your emotional sovereignty. Because in a world where everyone is screaming to be understood, the one who says less and means more is the one who commands the room. You don't need to be a mystery. You just need to be beyond explanation. And in that space, where they can't quite name you, they'll never risk underestimating you again. Most people don't change when you ask them to. They change when your absence becomes more painful than your presence was convenient. We recondition to believe that constant availability equals value, that the more you show up, explain yourself, and stay emotionally present, the more people will respect you. But this is a dangerous illusion, because the more accessible you are, the more easily you're taken for granted. The more visible you are, the more replaceable you become. Respect is rarely earned through presence. It's earned through strategic absence. Withdrawal is not weakness, it's not retreat, it's the loudest form of power that requires no explanation, because when you pull away not out of anger, but out of clarity, you transform yourself from a person into a consequence. And consequences can't be ignored. This is the Machiavellian pivot. When words fail, vanish. When energy is being siphoned, unplug. When boundaries are crossed, don't argue, disappear. Because most people don't respond to pleas. They respond to distance psychologically. Humans are wired to assign more value to what is scarce. This applies to time, resources, and especially attention. When you stop replying, when you stop showing up, when you stop performing emotional labor, people begin to feel the hole you once filled, and suddenly, everything you gave them for free now has weight. Distance forces reflection. Silence forces them to hear themselves. Strategic withdrawal triggers a recalibration in their behavior, not because you demanded it, but because your absence became a mirror they can't escape, and one that reveals just how much of your energy they assumed was endless. There's a reason Machiavelli advised rulers to appear sparingly. He knew that familiarity breeds complacency, and constant visibility breeds contempt. A prince who is always on display loses the mystique that protects him, but one who shows up with precision, vanishes when needed, and never justifies his distance, that man becomes unforgettable. You don't need to ghost out of spite. You don't need to weaponize silence as cruelty. You simply reclaim your presence as a privilege, not a guarantee. In relationships, this looks like pausing the cycle of over-explaining and proving your worth. You say your truth once clearly, and if it's not honored, you step back, not to manipulate, but to restore gravity to your time, your energy, your being in social settings. This looks like leaving early before you become background noise. People remember the one who left just before things got dull, not the one who stayed until the end, trying to matter in your career. This looks like declining to overextend when your contributions are undervalued. You don't announce your boundaries. You don't beg for recognition. You withdraw value until they feel the vacuum, because value isn't always measured by how much you give. It's measured by how much people notice. When you stop, psychological scarcity isn't a game. It's a recalibration. It tells others, you are not entitled to my attention, my time, or my emotional availability. And the moment they feel that detachment, a shift happens. Now they ask more carefully, they speak more thoughtfully, they treat you like someone they could lose, not someone they can use. This is emotional leverage without confrontation. It's power without aggression. It's leadership without volume. But here's the key. Withdrawal only works if it's done from clarity, not insecurity. If you vanish hoping they'll chase you, they won't. But if you vanish because you know they've lost access to your energy, they'll feel it before they understand it. You don't need to threaten your exit. You don't need to slam doors. You just let the room feel colder when you leave. Because real power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just disappears, and in the silence that follows, everything is redefined. The most dangerous person in the room is often the one who says the least. You don't need to dominate the space with volume. You don't need to flex, bark, or proclaim your strength. You just need to become a presence, one so quiet, so composed, that others begin to measure themselves against your stillness. You don't control the room by overwhelming it. You control the room by haunting it. This is the art of controlled presence. And it starts where most people fail, by resisting the impulse to explain yourself. We live in an age of overexpression. Everyone wants to be seen, understood, praised. But in that hunger to be visible, most people lose their mystique. They say too much, reveal too early, clarify too often, and once people can predict you, they stop respecting you. What is fully known becomes fully managed, but what remains undefined, that lingers in the mind like a warning. The difference between loud attention and long-term memory is silence. Loudness is rewarded in the moment, applause, laughter, recognition, but the room forgets it minutes later. Silence, on the other hand, is unnerving. It creates gaps that others rush to fill. They replay what you didn't say. They project meaning onto your expressions, and when they leave, they carry your presence with them, not because of what you gave them, but because of what you withheld. The fewer words you speak, the more each one weighs. This isn't new. It's ancient strategy. Consider Talleyrand, the French diplomat whose silence shifted the tides of empires. He would enter negotiations and let others talk themselves into defeat. He didn't assert control through domination. He radiated it through restraint. His silence wasn't empty. It was loaded. People feared his pauses more than others' speeches, because when someone reveals little, you start preparing for everything. That's the Machiavellian trick. You don't need to be feared for what you've done. You only need to be feared for what you might do. This psychological ambiguity is more powerful than any threat. Fear rooted in the known has a boundary. Fear rooted in the unknown has none. It's the same dynamic in modern leadership. Most compelling executives are rarely the ones who monologue through meetings. It's the one who listens more than he speaks, who rarely weighs in, but when he does, everyone goes silent, not because of his position, but because of the gravity of his voice. That gravity wasn't built through charisma. It was built through discipline, by choosing when to speak, by letting silence do the work. This is weaponized silence. It does three things. First, it creates tension. People become hyper-aware of your energy, your reactions, your absence. They start adjusting their tone before you've said a word. Second, it commands imagination. They begin crafting theories about your thoughts, your plans, your intent, and once they're doing that, you live in their heads rent-free. Third, it creates distance, not emotional coldness, but the sense that you are not fully reachable, and in a world where everything is accessible, what's unreachable becomes powerful. But silence only works when it's paired with presence. You can't vanish and expect people to feel your weight unless you've cultivated that contrast between quiet and quality. You don't need to be aloof or mysterious in a theatrical way. You simply speak when it matters. You answer only when it's worth answering. You stay calm when others escalate, and when you exit, you don't announce it. You let your absence do the talking. This is the difference between reaction and command. Most people are reacting. You, on the other hand, are observing, calculating, choosing when to engage, not because you're afraid to speak, but because you understand that silence is not the absence of power, it's the concentration of it. Fear what they might say, not what they've already said. That's the rule of strategic silence. People fear what they haven't yet heard, what hasn't yet been revealed. That's why the man who says little, but always seems to know more, is more intimidating than the one who explains everything. In every social game, there comes a point where people stop pushing boundaries, not because you scolded them, but because you stopped responding. You let their provocations fall flat. You gave no rise, no emotional tell. You became unreadable, and when people can't read you, they stop trying to control you. That's power. That's command. You don't need to fight to be respected. You don't need to argue to be understood. You don't need to speak to be remembered, because silence, when mastered, is not the absence of influence. It is the most refined form of it. You don't have to be rich. You don't have to be famous. You don't even have to be physically intimidating. You just have to be unreadable, because in every room you walk into, the people who hold power are not the loudest or most obvious. They're the ones others adjust themselves around, the ones whose presence shifts energy, and often they do this not by dominating the conversation, but by withholding just enough to make others chase. This is psychological warfare, but not in the traditional sense. This is quiet control, strategic ambiguity, and it's built, not with dramatic gestures, but with micro-behaviors, subtle habits practiced daily until your silence becomes louder than anyone else's words. It begins with the art of delayed response. When someone asks you a question, don't rush to answer. When they say something offensive, don't react immediately. When they try to provoke, stay still. Delay creates discomfort. Discomfort creates anticipation, and anticipation, if sustained, builds power. People start wondering if they've offended you, impressed you, confused you. That wondering is control, because while they're analyzing you, you remain unshaken. Then comes vague language. You don't need to lie, you simply avoid being overly clear. When someone asks what your plans are, say, "I've got something in the works." When they ask what you think, say, "I'm still considering." Vague language creates gaps, and human psychology hates gaps. People fill in the blanks with their own projections, which often makes you appear smarter, more complex, or more powerful than you intended. The key is not to overshare. The less you say, the more they imagine. Next is neutral expression. This is perhaps the most disarming form of strength. Most people give away everything with their face: approval, discomfort, excitement, insecurity. But if you train yourself to hold a neutral gaze, to stay still in your reactions, you instantly gain an edge. You become emotionally unpredictable. And when people can't read how you feel, they don't know how to manipulate you. They become careful. They adjust their tone. They become smaller, just in case you're offended, or worse, unimpressed. Then, strategic eye contact, not constant, not threatening, just intentional. Hold eye contact slightly longer than expected. Then look away, not with discomfort, but with indifference. It sends a signal. I see you, but I don't need you. I'm aware, but I'm not impressed. It's a way of telling people they've been evaluated and silently judged. And that quiet judgment lingers longer than any spoken criticism. And finally, one of the most powerful moves: leave early in conversations, in meetings, even in relationships. Leave slightly before people feel finished. It creates a psychological hook and emotional incompletion. The conversation didn't reach closure. The moment didn't resolve. That lingering uncertainty pulls them back toward you. They start thinking about what they should have said, what you were about to say, what it meant that you left. That's how presence becomes obsession, not through what you give, but through what you withhold. All of these tactics share one theme: scarcity. We are drawn to what feels limited. Scarcity signals value, but not just physical absence, emotional unavailability. The sense that someone is present, but not fully reachable, warm, but not fully open. That thin line between connection and detachment creates tension, and tension builds fascination. This is not about being cold. It's about being unpredictable in how much of yourself you reveal. Unpredictability is the ultimate status symbol. The dog is predictable. It wags its tail, obeys commands, always returns. The wolf is different. It appears, it watches, it vanishes, and in that unpredictability, people adjust. They behave more carefully. They think twice before they speak. They calculate your silence, not your volume. By implementing these habits: delay, vagueness, neutrality, strategic eye contact, and withdrawal, you start to rewire how people respond to you. You become less accessible, less expected, and therefore more powerful even in casual spaces. You can train this presence in group conversations. Observe more than you speak. In texting, resist the urge to reply instantly. In meetings, speak with fewer but sharper words. Let others crowd the space. Let them reveal. Let them be loud. Your restraint will create distance. Your distance will create speculation, and speculation is what gives you psychological leverage over not chasing power. You're radiating it. Machiavelli understood this, not through speeches, but through silence, not through emotion, but through calculation. The prince who rules forever is not the one who conquers by force. It's the one people never fully understand, because when people can't understand you, they fear crossing you. They fear losing your validation. They Fear being forgotten by you. You don't need to control others. You just need to become the type of person they can't stop thinking about, not because you impressed them, but because you made them uncertain, and in that uncertainty, you became unforgettable. There is a line razor thin and difficult to maintain between being loved and being feared, between being respected and being obeyed, between presence and threat. Most people never learn to walk it. They lean too far into fear and become tyrants, or too far into love and become doormats. But those who master the middle, they don't just lead, they last. This is what Machiavelli understood better than anyone before or since. He didn't glorify cruelty. He didn't despise kindness. He simply knew the truth, that power built on either one alone is fragile. Love without fear leads to entitlement. Fear without respect breeds resentment. But combine the two, not violently, but subtly, and you get something far more durable. Reverent uncertainty. When people aren't sure how far you'd go, they hesitate. They adjust not because they hate you, but because they're unsure whether to admire you or avoid provoking you. That's influence. That's real presence. Too much warmth, and you become predictable. Predictable leads to exposure. Exposure leads to loss of leverage, but too much coldness, and you become resented. Distance turns into detachment, and detachment kills loyalty. The key is tension. You want people to feel your silence, not just hear it. You want your calm to weigh more than their noise. Every gesture you make should say, I see everything, but I owe you nothing. Not in bitterness, in restraint, because the one who reacts less always holds more power. This is why availability can be dangerous. The moment you are always reachable, always kind, always forgiving, you stop being respected. You become expected, taken for granted. And what's expected is never feared. What's predictable is never preserved. There's a deeper danger to becoming too detached. Power without connection turns you into a ghost. People obey, but they don't care. They follow, but they don't remember. Eventually, someone louder, more emotional, more human replaces you. So, what do? You balance the two like a shadow with weight. You make your silence rich with meaning. You leave room for fear, but not terror. You cultivate stillness, but you leave space for sudden insight. You show that while you are capable of great harm, you choose discipline instead, that you could strike but haven't. This is the essence of commanding respect without demanding it. Think of the people in your life you truly respect, not because they were the loudest, not because they punished you, but because they carried themselves with gravity. Their silence was earned. Their restraint was meaningful. They didn't need to prove anything, because they didn't fear being misunderstood, and that made you watch them more carefully. This is the final form of power, not dominance, not seduction, but reputation shaped by ambiguity. It's not about being loved. Love fades. It's not about being feared. Fear invites rebellion. It's about being considered before someone disrespects you. They pause before someone asks for more. They hesitate, not because you threatened them, but because your energy, your discipline, your mystery made them cautious. That's the edge you cultivate, and it doesn't require cruelty. It requires calculated silence, because the most powerful presence is the one that makes people adjust themselves without ever asking them to. Machiavelli said, "It is better to be feared than loved." If you cannot be both, but what he showed us quietly, philosophically, is that the most effective leader is not the one who picks one or the other. That's the one whose presence makes people unsure which one they feel. Respect without intimacy, fear without violence, not a tyrant, not a savior, but something much harder to challenge, a presence that bends the room without raising its voice. If this video shifted how you see power, presence, or the psychology of influence, don't let the insight end here. Subscribe for more content that peels back the layers of manipulation, strategy, and human behavior. Leave a comment below. What part resonated most with you? Or better yet, what did you feel but didn't expect to? And if you know someone who's been underestimated too long, share this with them. Because in a world obsessed with volume, the ones who whisper with weight are the ones truly remembered. Stay sharp, stay unreadable. And I'll see you in the next one.